respect to the ideas of sort of the Russian soul and this kind of thing that you were covering in your book, it does seem, obviously, as you were saying, Putin is definitely making use of those for his own sort of propaganda purposes. And then what I picked up from your book was actually looking and saying, well, we have to understand these ideas as we're going into the future. We need to actually get a good grasp of them and find those aspects of them that are pointing towards something maybe more positive than what the sort of current dictatorial regime in Russia is trying to make use of them for. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm not how should I say, I'm not trying to celebrate Putin as a spiritual leader or anything like that. It was, I mean, the thing was, it was surprising when I read in an article about him that he had at an annual meeting of United Russia, which is the the major political party there, in 2015, I believe. He gave, among other things, he gave his regional governors a reading list of books to read, and and for, to get ideas about the new Russia, because they're going through an identity crisis for quite some time, trying to have some vision of who they are. They're not communists anymore. They're not Marxists. It's they're not the West. So what are they? And on this list were two Russian philosophers that I had read. I don't read Russian. I've never been to Russia. I'm not a Russian scholar. So I'm just a punter who's read this stuff in translation and, just, liked it. And one of them is Nikolai Berdayev, who's not well known, but back in the 30s and 40s, he was well known. He was strange Christian, ex-Marxist Christian existentialist, obsessed with the notion of freedom and this kind of what do you want to call it? This kind of creative minority of kind of a spiritual aristocracy, not in any way that would lord it over other people, but who were committed to these kind of deep questions of meaning and purpose and all of that. And then the other was Vladimir Soloviev, who's generally regarded as the first Russian philosopher. I mean, there were moralists and essayists and social thinkers before them, and but Soloviev was the first one to really kind of use the vocabulary of Western philosophy. And this is the 1870s up to the turn of that century. And I just thought that was surprising because they're not page turners. I mean, if you like ideas, they write very eloquently about the ideas, but they're not, it's not something you just get through over the weekend. And so that impressed me in the first place. I mean, whatever Putin's tactic or strategy for doing that, that's interesting. And I wonder how many of these governors actually did read it. But there was a response to this from David Brooks in the New York Times, and he was basically, I mean, I just thought the response was, he left out quite a bit. I mean, basically he was saying, oh, these philosophers Putin is talking about and name dropping, they're these, what we would call Russian exceptionalists these days. They have this idea that Russia has this messianic mission, a world historical place in civilization and so on and so on. And they were in different ways talking about this kind of Russian universalism that was going to lead the world into a new kind of cultural epoch in the 20th century. But this was before the Bolsheviks came in. And one of the things I different times when I've been interviewed since the book came out, I've had to, I'm sure it's not with you, but I've had to remind people that Russia is not the USSR. I mean, it's the USSR, but there was Russia before for a long time, then the USSR. But that's what we all know, basically, because even we don't really have any idea what Russia is now. I mean, it's not the USSR. It's okay. It's the gangster politics and oligarchs and all that. So in any case, and on top of the fact that Putin was asking his governors to read philosophers, the philosophers themselves I thought had very important things to say. And when they were saying it back during their time 100 years ago, there was this expectation that the West was in decline, and Western philosophy had just become very materialist and reductive and utilitarian, and all based on economics and and things of that sort. And they were all trying to bring back what we would call the soul in a general sense, questions of value and meaning and purpose and existential identity and all this sort of thing that the West had just said, well, that's all kind of, nonsense. It's, the sort of positivism that today goes by the name of scientism now, but it was positivism then. And Russian philosophy was all in response to that. It was all an attempt to try and complement that or transcend it in a, Hegelian kind of way, to unite, supposed to be the Western intellect and logic with this Russian intuition and mystical sense of soul and all that. And, it's cliches, but this was, the general idea. Different people expected that. So I just thought, well, here, 100 years later, these guys didn't get a chance to be heard in the West back then. Now it's 100 years later. Maybe we should, pay attention to them. Maybe it's kind of in some way prescient that Putin has mentioned them so that we can kind of, learn from them again. And I think they do have lots of ideas that do address the issues that we have today. They're not in a time capsule. They wrote about these things 100 years ago, but the things that they wrote about are still in place today, and actually things have got worse.
Yeah. And it's timely as well, because I think that there's, as you noticed with the New York Times article, that there's maybe a kind of politically driven willful lack of engagement with Russian culture on many levels as a result of the sort of, the tectonic plates of kind of Russia and Europe and America are all kind of shifting. You get journals like the New York Times just going, oh, look at these philosophers that Putin's recommending. Well, they must be Russian exceptionalists, and even if you want to discredit anything now, you just say, well, that comes from Russian hackers. That's not, backdated back then. Oh, those guys were Russian hackers too, before hacking was a thing, So, yeah.
I mean, again, it's like it was surprising to me that I wound up doing the book. I mean, I'm a fan of, like I said, Russian literature, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and all that. But it wasn't like, I wanted to go to bat for Russia per se. Because in my previous book, Dark Star Rising, which is about this occult politics, supposedly. Well, it is, around Trump. It's not the only thing around him, but around Trump and also around Putin and other political, power holders. And I wrote quite a bit about Russia in there, and Putin's kind of virtual Russia that he had, well, still in place, through his PR man, his spin doctor, Vladislav Surkov, who, like throughout the 2000s, just created this whole kind of reality TV Russia, within which there was this kind of resurgence and efflorescence, a variety of weird, occult, Fortean, strange, weird kinds of things happening. And it seemed to be, this bubbling cauldron of all these strange kind of wacky ideas that were getting a lot of press and really taken seriously. I mean, one example is this fellow named Lev Gumilev, who we don't know in the West, and he died in the early 90s. But he was the son of two poets from the symbolist period. And I think it was Nikolai Gumilev's his father, and he was killed by the Cheka, and Anna Akhmatova was his mother, and she, had to put up with him being in the Gulag for ages and ages. But he developed this weird kind of idea about what he called, well, this kind of ethnography, but it had to do with this strange kind of cosmic influence on ethnic races. And he's another one who, while he was in the Gulag, he was developing this whole kind of this new vision of Russia that wasn't Marxist, and it wasn't the West. And it went back to its supposed, Asian roots, or at least its Mongol inheritance. There was this period for a few centuries when the Mongols, they were under the Mongol yoke and all that. And this is all this kind of Asiatic and, primal and strange, barbaric sort of inheritance that most Russian history wants to excuse, or this was a horrible time, oh, we were in captivity. But he was saying, no, we should really look to this. They were our saviors. The Mongols saved us from the West. We would have been conquered by, you know, the West and made Catholic and or whatever, Protestant, or all this kind of horrible stuff would have happened. And instead, you know, we were saved by the Mongols, and then we have to get back to this kind of roots. And he wrote this very romantic, kind of adventurous history of going back to the steppes and all that. And nobody took it seriously until sort of late 80s when everything started to open up. But, you know, Glasnost, Perestroika and all that, everything opened up, and he became this kind of hero. And just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, his books were like just published, you know, huge numbers, and you know, they were all mandatory reading in universities. And I mean, I don't know if that's still the case, but you know, like there were postage stamps, there were universities named after him, and all this kind of thing. And he had these weird ideas about there was this kind of force that ran through ethnic groups that he called passionarity, and it was that which made the Mongols, you know, stampede across the steppes, and it you know, it drove these vast migrations. It's this kind of vitality, or this kind of weird itch to do something. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but it's like you had too much coffee and you have to get going and do something. And this was something that he felt he could actually chart, he could measure in actual kind of units, like Reich, you know, Wilhelm Reich, that he could measure the orgone. And it's sort of similar to that. And he was saying, oh, the West is just, it's run out of all its passionarity, but we, you know, the Russians, we're still a young race, and we have a lot of it, and all this kind of, and there's a variety of different, you know, kind of scenarios like that, where it's sunspots that do it, or you know, some other. So there's this strange kind of cosmic sense that's part of the mainstream kind of Russian scientific idea. I mean, one of the weirdest stories in the book is about Nikolai Fedorov, who was this very strange character in the late 19th century, a friend of Dostoevsky, friend of Soloviev. Tolstoy admired him, but he had one idée fixe, and that was there was what he called the common task, and this would be this mission, you know, this goal that would unite the entire human race on the planet, and that was to revive the dead. He didn't know how you were going to do it, but he knew it had to be done. It came to him like in a revelation that this and once we all recognized this, we would put our shoulder to the wheel and actually make it happen. So in some way, we were going to, you know, there would be the first resurrection of somebody who dies in the hospital in some way. Then there was some way we would be able to animate all the corpses that are, and the ones that there's not much left of them, there's a way where we can collect all this dust that he, you know, he calls it. It's kind of like weird sort of stuff. And then it's like the dust at this time, so much of it has gone out into space. So we're going to have to find ways to collect all that. And that's just the first problem. The next thing is like, where are we going to put them? And so when everybody's back, we have to find other habitable planets. And in a strange way, his ideas set kind of the Soviet space program in motion, because one of his followers, a fellow named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, he actually figured out it is rocket science, the real rocket science, to propulsion and all that, and how to get things, you know, out, and and all that. And he was another one of these cosmists, and he had these other vast ideas about, you know, humanity's place in the cosmos. And a lot of that lines up with a lot of our ecological thinking, because the fundamental idea is that, you know, we're not these separate individual little egos out for ourselves. We're part of these vast, you know, just we're a forest of people, just like there's a forest of trees, and you know, so we are a kind of human forest, and we're part of the planet in the same way that trees and clouds and lakes, you know, we're not strange, you know, visitors from another planet, you know, or chance occurrences. We're part of this natural. And it's strange enough, because at the same time, and this stuff is getting sort of discussed in academic circles in Moscow, it's around the same time that P.D. Uspensky was meeting Gurdjieff, you know, the enigmatic Armenian Greek esoteric teacher. And he was saying much the same things about how huge human events, social events, wars, revolutions, they're involved in cosmic processes, and planetary motions are affecting things on the Earth, or we're food for the moon, or something like that. And so
Mm.
it's very strange, because when I first came across it, wow, it's a really strange idea. And then I'm not saying it's not, I'm not saying Gurdjieff stole it or something. It's just that you realize, oh, this is coming out of a context where a lot of these ideas were also just, sort of being said by other people at the time. So again, that's a very different view than how, we tend to see ourselves in the West. We don't really, I mean, the alternative people see us as part of this, conscious, sentient planet and all that, but the mainstream people don't. The nature is just something out there to use and all that kind of thing.
Mm. And it also occurred to me when I was reading in the book about Fedorov, if I'm pronouncing his name right, that he does also prefigure the transhumanist kind of ideas that are floating around. They're a funny one here in the West at the moment, because they're very niche, but they're also niche within a very wealthy and influential group of people. So we've got.
Well, it costs a lot of money to be transhuman.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's funny you mentioned that, because that's I'm working on a book now, but the next book I have is I want to do something about that. It's going to be transhuman, all too transhuman. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Somebody will take it.
Yeah.
In any case, but that's down the line.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. It's just the transhumanist ideology, and how it does seem to have these occult roots in essence. Seems
well,
to.
I mean, little tangent. I mean, the term was coined by Julian Huxley.
That's right. Yeah.
Brother of Aldous Huxley.
Yeah.
And I think it was a new wine for old bottles, or I think that's sort of roughly the title of the book. But he didn't see it in terms of technology. He saw it in terms of our development as humans, not adding to ourselves in some way. And he actually talks about art being this means of being transpersonal, and a kind of tradition or system of knowledge that prods us on to more evolution or something like that. So kind of later on, when the computers kicked off, that's when it starts to get sort of more machine kind of thing. Although I'm sure if somebody could argue and say no, it was that all the way. But if you know that article by Samuel Butler, that he wrote in New Zealand, Darwin Among the Machines. He was one of the first ones to. He's doing the Terminator sort of scenario in this essay article of his. It was 1870 or something around there, and it's about how, well, if Darwin's right, what's going to stop the machines from evolving? They'll evolve, and they'll become intelligence, and they'll recognize that they have an advantage over us in the battle of survival of the fittest and all that. So some people picked up on the kind of danger, or the possible danger involved in all that kind of thing. I mean, but you're right. I mean, the Cosmos did have this kind of transhuman sense, and also like who is it, Tipler and Barrow with the anthropic, principle, the anthropic cosmological principle. The whole idea that we're, life will start somewhere, intelligence will start somewhere, and then it will go out and seed, the rest of the cosmos. And they were talking about that too. I mean, Fedorov had this fantastic idea. He was talking about spaceship Earth well before, like, what was it, Buckminster Fuller who coined that? I forget exactly who, in the 60s. But he said, we have to find a way to unchain the Earth from the sun and actually use it as a vehicle to travel through space. And and you have to, not only the ideas are incredible, but his own life. He's one of these holy saints, these kind of holy fools that Russia produced, where everything is absolutely committed to his ideals. And he had no money. Any money he had, he gave away. One of his great fears was to be found dead with some money in his pocket. So he just gave money away all the time. He worked at this fantastic library in the museum for years and years and years. And this is where people like Dostoevsky would go to see him, or this fellow Konstantin Tsiolkovsky would go and listen to him talk. He didn't want any pictures taken of him. There's one or two, and the artist had to hide behind like a shelf of books to sort of catch him unawares. He slept on a kind of chest, and it wasn't even flat. It was, it was like this, apparently. And he slept like that, and he had a book as a pillow. He initially didn't write his ideas down, and he was pressed to do it by his sort of amanuensis, this, you know, close, his Boswell, as it were. And it's just incredible that he had this effect sort of by word of mouth, you know, really. And this is another kind of characterological trait out of the great Russian soul, is that they produce these what they call the starets, you know, these deeply, passionately religious, you know, figures. He wasn't necessarily religious in that sense, but he did have, he had this saintly kind of character, and he radiated that same kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, larger than life, you know, sort of aura. And yeah, but these people that impressed by their sheer kind of, you know, spiritual stature. You know, he cowed people like Tolstoy, and Tolstoy was like, you know, a force of nature. So it's sort of like you have to. So yeah, and then in more contemporary terms, a lot of these ideas, like Gumilyev's ideas, influenced other people. And he talks about how this passionarity, this kind of, you know, inner vitality that drives us to go stampede and have a revolution or a war or something, is something that's influenced by cosmic forces, cosmic rays. So like somehow cosmic rays come down, they do something, you know, they ionize the air, whatever they do something that makes us go. And, you know, we're not the masters of our fate in that way. So there's not the Western sense of I'm an individual who, you know, I you know, choose, I make my own choices, I chart my own course, and say, no, you're part of this larger thing that transcends you. And one of the sort of metaphors I go back to throughout the book is something that the German historian or philosopher of history, Oswald Spengler, said way back 100 years ago in his book, The Decline of the West. He said, in the West, we say I, and we look up at the sky, and, you know, reaching up to the, you know, the Father God up there. And it's each individual one of us like reaching up to heaven, and you can see it in the Gothic cathedrals and that kind of thing. But he said the Russian doesn't look up, and he's not interested in me. He looks out, you know, and he's interested in we, all of us, you know. And it's this kind of, you know, if you know the terrain, it's a kind of psychogeography, because it's the vast endless steppes and the vast endless plains and all of that, and it's not broken up by much. And you know, so it's always looking out into the distance, and then you get this notion of the pilgrimage too, because it's this constant kind of walking on this kind of, you know, infinite horizons around them and all that. And so I try to bring things, you know, like that out in the book. And I didn't start out wanting to write a history of Russia, but once I got going, I didn't know anything about it. Well, people say it's obvious. All you have to do is read the book, and you'll see that. But no, seriously, folks, no. But you know, in the sense that I knew, you know, Rasputin and the Romanovs and the revolution and all that period, but I didn't know much about the rest of it. And it just fascinated me, you know, learning it. And so it became this kind of narrative, because I wanted to find out what happened next, you know, myself, you know, because it's just such a turbulent, eventful history. I mean, a lot happens all the time in Russian history, as far as I can see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really like the way you brought out in the book this relationship between the Russian landscape and the you know the development of any of these sort of cultural trends. So, for example, the hermits who would wander out into the forest to escape civilization and be with the, you know, the peace of nature, and they could commune with God there. And then people would start to drift out and join them, and then they'd start a monastery, and then obviously the monastery needs people to support the monastery, so people start moving out there and start farming the land, and then the Russian sort of civilization expands out, and then people have to go further out. The hermits have to sort of retreat further. So you've got this kind of perpetual sort of running away from. It reminds me a little bit of Alan Watts once said something like, "The reason the universe is expanding is it's trying to get away from scientists trying to measure it." You know, so
Well, I think it's certainly trying to add an extra 2 meters
yeah,
to itself these days. So I wonder if they figured that out.
exactly.
But but no, again, that was a remarkable story. And one of the books I plundered, my book, is by James Billington, American historian of Russia, who's written quite a few books about it. But there's one called The Icon and the Axe, and it's this, big thick doorstopper. But that image comes from precisely what you're saying, how Russia expanded. And a lot of this was happening when it was under the yoke of the Mongols as well, because they surprisingly weren't, they're very tolerant when it came to religion. They didn't really care. They just wanted you to pay the tribute, and bow your head and hit your head on the ground every now and then. But what would happen is that you get a monk, he wants to go out into the wilderness, which for them wasn't the desert as it was for the Desert Fathers, but it was these great seas of aspen and whatever, the cedar forests. And they would go and they'd be practicing this hesychist kind of meditation, where they're trying to it's just what they call the Jesus prayer. You repeat this prayer over and over again, constantly, and it becomes like a mantra. And then they would get into the state where they would perceive what they call the uncreated light. This was this kind of light, but it wasn't physical light. It was another kind of spiritual light, and this was sort of basically seeing God, as it were. And again, there's a whole controversy throughout the Eastern Orthodox Church about that. And that's another story that runs through. So, but in order to practice that, you get away from the towns, because most of the monasteries originally were in the town too. They were close, and then it became a different practice to sort of have them away from the town. And yeah, you're right. One or two would go out and they become hermits and get down to doing their thing, and others would join them. And as you said, then it would get bigger and bigger. And then they said, geez, we got to go because there's another town. And then they would push out into the wilderness. And that's really how it grew. So it was this kind of, I don't want to quote, collateral benefit of, it was kind of like a religious colonization, but they weren't really going out to proselytize, although some did. But it wasn't really that kind of mission. They weren't going out to convert. They were going out to have mystical experiences, and a kind of economy, would grow up around them. But that pushed out, and some went really, really far. They went up to the White Sea, which is up by the Arctic, and other inaccessible sorts of places. And again, you have to remember, people walked to a lot of places too, like these infinite pilgrimages. I mean, Rasputin, even in the late 19th century, he walked from Siberia to the Holy Land. Or to Mount Athos, where he didn't have a particularly good time, and then took in the Holy Land as well. So they're these enormous beings that they're and it's like Berdyaev says in the the Russian soul, it's either all or nothing. It's the millennium or it's the end of the world, or it's so they're not lukewarm. They're not able to find this middle ground like the West. Again, I'm sure there's Russians who can. I'm sure I know this is a cliche, but just like all the cliches are about the Western, me, me, ego, all that kind of thing, and can I buy things all the time? That's a cliche as well. But they're rooted in something that's true, and all that. And so that's another thing. There's all these contradictions and oppositions and antinomian kind of polarities and forces working in it that oftentimes just collapse into this utter chaos and destruction. But sometimes they kind of come together in creative ways and produce a fluorescence of art or music or literature or spirituality.
It seems to me as well as, obviously there's always caveats about talking about the Russian soul or the Western soul or whatever it is, but at the same time, I think this came up in your recent interview with I think it was Jeffrey Mishlove, You Thinking Aloud, and the kind of the effect of mysticism on kind of ideas of Russia's destiny on the global scene seem to be a little closer to the surface, say, than in Britain, where it's kind of there. You know, you have John Dee coming up with the term the British Empire, and harking back to the sort of Arthurian age, and using that as a mythic pretext for Britain, you know, going out and colonizing the world, Britain rather than England. But at the same time, you know, that overall, you know, the history of the British Empire, the kind of official history, is very sort of stern and sort of matter of fact, and there's a little bit of Church of England, but you know, not too crazy. But with perhaps with the you know, the Russian ideas of you know, Russia's sort of destiny is balancing out the West and the East and all of this kind of thing, seem to be a little closer to the surface, would you say?
Well, I mean, they had this. Well, this comes from their adopting, you know, Greek Orthodox Christianity back, I don't know, 989 or something like that, and I mean that in itself. Well, it kind of, that's when Russia as we know it kind of starts, and Queen Olga, who's already converted from the pagan beliefs, goes to visit Byzantium, and she's completely bowled over by the beauty of Hagia Sophia and the dome and the icons and the incense and all of that, and so she wants to bring that back, and then it finally becomes the official religion. And Greek Orthodox had a very strong sense of the apocalypse, in the sense of, you know, history was heading towards the second coming, and there wasn't much debate about it, and this was something that was adopted by the Russians when they adopted it. This was part of the whole thing, and this beauty that, you know, not converted but absolutely convinced Queen Olga was part of that, because this whole notion of the icons was like, well, this is what it's going to be like, you know, in the new world. This is the transfiguration, and we could here's some of it now. So from the beginning, art had this transformative power for the Russians, and this is what I say in the book, where they Russians, they want to be saved by the art. It has this salvific power where, you know, Westerners want to be satisfied by it. So it's an aesthetic kind of thing. And, you know, the two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, but there's something very, very specifically, you know, religious in this notion of art being this transfiguring, transformational kind of power. And yeah, and then, so, you know, Constantinople is the second Rome. You know, the first Rome has fallen already. And then there becomes this myth of the third Rome that Moscow takes on later on. And this is after Constantinople falls in 1453 to the Turks. And in many ways, that kickstarts the Renaissance back over on the other side of the world. But what it does in Russia is that Moscow, which has become the powerful city to emerge after the Mongol yoke. It was Kiev before, then Moscow becomes the center, and it's the third Rome, you know, and it's taken on, you know, the church's fall, and again, and there was this whole battle in the Russian church as well, whether it was Russian or Greek, and it was all, you know, kind of battles within there and that, but it became, okay, it's Russian, you know, Russia's the third Rome, and we have this destiny to carry on the true Christian word. And again, it had this millenarian sense to it. I mean, at different times throughout its history, you know, the notion of the apocalypse, of, you know, the official apocalypse from the scripture was on its way, and it was going to happen. And you know, I mean, that same kind of linear sense that history is heading towards something, that's, you know, obviously that's in Marx. It's the classless society, and it's not something that the West has, or you know, you had Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history, but that basically meant that, you know, free market capitalism was made available to everybody, and you know, liberal democracies were, you know, carried the day and all that. So it was the end of history in this Hegelian sense, but it not for the people who believed in this transfiguring kind of, you know, apocalyptic denouement of things. And they really believed, you know, it was going to happen at sort of different times. And you know, there were debates over what exactly the date was going to be, because, you know, different calendars and all that. And so, I mean, that's sort of part of the and Berdyaev, Nikolai Berdyaev, who wrote this book called The Russian Idea, which is a sort of philosophical history of Russia. He says they're again this thing about they have no patience with the middle way. They're not very good with waiting. So it's like it's either like now or nothing. History is kind of in the way of the new world. It's kind of in the way of this this transfiguration. And you have some rather eccentric thinkers in Russia today that agree with that, and that they want to bring on, in some, at least they've spouted that kind of rhetoric at different times. They want to bring on this kind of apocalypse. I've talked about one character, this fellow named Alexander Dugin. I talk about it a little bit in this book, but I talk about it more in Dark Star Rising. But he's someone who is in this kind of strange milieu of occult politics, and he's a reader of Julius Evola, who's the Italian esoteric philosopher in the 20th century who cozied up to Mussolini and National Socialism, and had was the imminence Greece behind a lot of neo-fascist groups and people in the alt-right, the alternative right, and Steve Bannon and all that, so in this kind of little circle or orbits around Trump, this stuff was getting read and talked about, and likewise around Putin, and Dugin was one of the people who were doing that. But he has this whole vision of some ultimate clash between what he calls the Atlanticists and the Eurasians, and the Atlanticists are the Western mercantile seafaring nations, so it's Great Britain, the US, and whatever. It's all about the market. It's all about trade. It's all about, they want to globalize the world. They like the idea of Fukuyama's end of history, because yes, the whole world is a global shopping mall. And against that, you have the mother of all continents, the greatest landmass on the planet, which is Eurasia, which stretches from Vladivostok to, well, it would stretch to Dublin if Dugin had his way, but it stops somewhere around, I don't know, around Kiev or something. But it's the hierarchy. It stands for hierarchy. It stands for traditional values. It stands for spiritual values, not the material values of the West and all that. So again, it's rhetoric for some. It's real ideas that they believe in for others. It's something that can be used in a strategy for others and all that. But it's still something that's there, and it's bubbling away. So so it seems to be part of, if not the agenda, at least there's they put a pin in it for later on, maybe.
Yeah, and certainly Dugin seems to be always kind of lurking somewhere in the background of contemporary sort of Russian ideas of self-identity. As you say, you spoke more about in Dark Star Rising. And that interesting thing with sort of Dugin and Evola as well is that I've stumbled across some traditionalist leaning types, people who are really followers of Evola, who think that Dugin is a kind of postmodern imposter who's kind of he's corrupting it and taking it in this sort of and then that of course brings in that ties in with the kind of the use of chaos magic and these postmodern ideas by the alt-right, as you also wrote about in Dark Star Rising as well. So it's an lot of interesting paradoxes going on.
Well, yeah, I think that's the thing. I mean, one of the themes in Dark Star Rising is when is the simulation the real thing, or is there a real thing anymore? And so when I mean, the postmodern thing is you could do it and if somebody's upset by it and say, "Oh man, it's just a joke. Oh God, are you that lame? You didn't see it was a joke." And if they're not upset, then it's this brilliant idea you had. So you can. It's kind of this. What is it? Plausible deniability about anything all the time, and it's this kind of ironic kind of stance. And well, that's what I think. I say in that book that Dugin does, and other people do as well. They kind of Velcro together lots of different things, and they're not really that interested in being a traditionalist. I just assume he likes the the ideas are very bold, and they're very anti-PC, and they're very anti-liberal, and they're shocking and all of that. And so it's something he can play with, and he can throw a bunch of that together with something from, you know, National Socialism or whatever. And but you know, as it's saying, Dark Side Rising, Avila himself practiced the kind of new thought or mental science or mental magic that the alt-right was supposed to be practicing in order to have helped Trump get elected. So again, it's not, you know, it's not too far-fetched, but you know, we do live in this. It's what I call the cultural delta. It was like all the silt from years and years of the kind of cultural stream is just kind of collected around, you know, and it's all flattened out, and everything is just like this now. And you can, like, you know, there isn't any kind of stream going anywhere. It's all kind of around you, and you can mix and match and play with all these different kinds of things. And yeah, this is postmodern kind of, you know, and well, some ways I can understand traditionalists who want, oh, you have to keep it pure. And but not that I don't particularly care for traditionalism myself. It in many ways, it strikes me as a kind of fundamentalist esotericism. But I could understand, you know, the desire to kind of, you know, not adulterate it with all these other ideas. But it's you're going to have a tough, you know, job trying to do that, because we live in a time where everything is just up. You can play around with it and put it together in all different kinds of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that occurred to me as you were talking about Dugin kind of velcroing things together from different places. It sort of he had a background as a punk, didn't he? And so,
well, yeah, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's the story. He starts out as a anti-Soviet punk in the '80s, and he gets arrested for singing an anti-Soviet song at a party. So, I mean, it's DIY. You know, it's kind of like do it yourself, and yeah, you know, go for it. You know, by all means. And you know, he went through all these different transformations of different strange you know, political stances, and was kind of like a quick change artist. So he'd start out as one thing, then something else, and went from anti-Soviet to being a Soviet man. And then he had yeah, what do they call it, the brown red, you know, group. It's National Bolshevism, so it's like National Socialism, Bolshevism coming together. And it's not in this book, but in the other book I say, you know, he joined different political parties, like, you know, people used to be in different bands. You know, so you know, he's sort of like, oh, join. Oh, I'm doing this now, and you know, and it is this kind of punk, do it yourself. You know, can't you take a joke kind of thing? Pretend and dress up and shock and all that. And but that makes, you know, that makes a lot of sense these days. That seems to be how you know, well, politics seem to be run in many ways that way now. I mean, we have, you know. Well, sadly, the United States has turned into, you know, reality TV show. I've had to turn it off. I can't watch much more of it, and so I don't know if the ratings have gone up or down lately. But no, I mean, that's one of the, and the other thing I would say is precisely because in Russia they had a lot of this virtual reality for such a long time, inventing all these kinds of things, you know, making up lots of stuff, that I think that ran out of steam. And you know, what strikes me Putin was doing is like, okay, now we need something more solid. We need a more solid vision identity. It's not so much entertaining the, you know, the masses anymore, or keeping everybody busy, or pretending to have this kind of democratic political debate when actually both sides of this debate are just invented by, you know, the spin doctors who are creating, you know, this fake kind of political you know, culture out there. But it's like, okay, that worked for a while, but now we really need a strong, solid kind of idea of who we are and what it means and where we're going. And this is, you know, why he's reached back to these philosophers. And also, you know, he's very much part of the, you know, the resurgence of the church. He's gone to many, many different religious sites. You know, he's been at the opening of monasteries. He's gone on some pilgrimages, you know, things of that sort himself. And so that's very much a part of the identity. And again, that's very different from the West. You know, I mean, at least in America, there's separation of church and state. So you have the Church of England here, but you don't have the Church of America. But hey, you know, coming soon perhaps. But you know, you don't have that. Whereas Russia is, you know, that, you know, it's been stronger in and out different times, and there's been great tension to try and, you know, have it be less powerful. And at different times in its history, it's been a theocracy, you know, where it's actually run everything. And I mean, during the time of Ivan the Terrible, it was all like one huge monastery.
Mm.
almost. It was like very strict, religious rites and rules and practices and behavior were expected, and you were punished very severely if you didn't follow them and all that. So it just seems like it's something that's much more in, I don't know, I don't want to say the DNA, it just sounds too cliche, but something like that, where it's not something added on. It's something that's actually right in the middle of what it means to be Russian.
Mm. Yeah. As you mentioned, Dugin and his sort of flirtation with the very strange national Bolshevik movement. I was wondering, and this ties in with your punk days in New York as a,
Yeah, when I was in political, no.
yeah, yeah, and with specifically is one particular character that I remember was Eduard Limonov. If you ever come across this guy, and he was
Yeah, yeah.
knocking
He
about the New York punk scene.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, he's supposed. I mean, he might have been. I didn't know him. I wouldn't have known him had I seen him. But yeah, he was around, and he was supposed to be. And what is it? It's Me, Eddie. Just weird kind of novel, and it's all very transgressive, and all that kind of stuff. And I think Solzhenitsyn called him an insect. He was an insect that wrote pornography or something like that. Yeah, but they were together. I mean, I don't talk about him in this book, but they were together at a certain point and were, it's kind of like the Situationists, I guess, or something like that, where you turn this political stuff into a kind of art. But they were very serious too. I mean, he was like, Limonov, he was out fighting in Serbia and places like that. So he was like, doing it. And I don't know, I know there were some. I read something about Dugin being involved in some of the, things going on in Crimea or whatever, or other kind of, Georgia, stuff like that. So, but I think they take that kind of thing very seriously, or at least it's not, it's not something that they would shy from.
Yeah.
But no, again, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people who said, "Oh yeah, I mean, William Burroughs was supposed to be at CBGB's every night," and I can't say I ever saw him. But then again, he called himself, the hombre invisible. So, maybe, maybe it was true. I don't know, or maybe I just didn't get invited to those parties. That might be it too.
Yeah, in the run up to our conversation today, as I was reading two books, I was reading Return of Holy Russia, but I also read New York Rocker too,
Oh, okay.
and it was both rollicking good reads, and in very different ways. And one of the most entertaining chapters in New York Rocker, I think, is where you go into your time as the was it the bass player for Iggy Pop?
I was one of the
Guitarist, that's it.
guitarists.
Yeah,
Yeah.
rhythm guitarist, right? Or
Yeah,
a bit of
yeah,
lead
yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
No.
Yeah,
Once I saved the show by jumping in and doing the lead, and everybody
that's
else flubbed it.
yeah,
So.
yeah. And it just one of the things I just found fascinating looking at this account of your time was how different the music world is now. That Iggy Pop in the early '80s was considered kind of a little down on his luck comparatively, and yet you guys still had this massive tour bus with a secret
Oh yeah, yeah.
room in the back where Iggy could go and do drugs and groupies and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, it was like it was kind of like the Wild Bunch,
Mm,
if you remember that film. And it was he was with, I think it was Arista, was the record company, and I think they did. This was the third album, and if this one wasn't a hit, they were dropping him. And it was this album called Party, which I don't know. I don't know if it's more memorable or not, but. That was the idea. I said, well, album's called Party, and that's what we're going to do. And so it was like, it was kind of, I mean, the second tour we flew, so maybe they did make some money. We
mm,
didn't have the bus, but that was a while. I mean, I say in the book, there must have been like a disco band who had it before, because it was all this weird plush chrome and blue flashing lights and everything. There was the back room with the screen, and oh yeah, yeah, that was. And I had some weird experiences on, and I mean, not there were weird fun experiences, but there's some other weird, very strange experiences on that. And I mentioned the book. His favorite movies were Pink Flamingo,
mm.
and the John Waters film, and Elephant Man. And Debbie does Dallas, sadly. So I went into my own little booth and closed the screen. But no, there was that was it. I after that the second tour, that's when I retired from rock and roll. I hung my Stratocaster up on the wall, and I didn't do much of anything for a few years. I mean, one thing I did do is I had some money, and I went on what I called later called the mini search for the miraculous, which took me here and up the continent, and I went to Chartres, and we found we went to. I was involved in the Gurdjieff work at the time, and we went to Fontainebleau and found the site of where his harmonious Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man was, and places like Stonehenge and Avebury and Glastonbury. But I also hitchhiked down to Cornwall, and this is when I made my pilgrimage to Colin Wilson, who's been sort of a major influence on my career. And he lived in this tiny village called Gorin Haven. I think next to Mevagissey, which I guess was sort of a big town. And just spent a day down there and discussing, reading some manuscript he was working on, and then he talked about his ideas, and we started up a friendship and a correspondence that lasted until a few years ago when he died. He died in 2013.
Yeah, it's very much. Yeah, go.
I was going to say I was reading his book, The Occult, back in 1975. That first got me interested in all this sort of thing when I was playing in Blondie, and before Blondie was anything. I was living on the Bowery, which was Skid Row. Kind of. It's unrecognizable now if you go there. It's all fancy restaurants and hotels, and everything is. I can't get into the places that are there now. But back then it was down and out. But we were living in this loft space, and this artist who lived in there, he was really into Crowley, and he had the Crowley tarot deck, and we used to do these readings, and he did these paintings based on the trump cards. But somewhere along the line, I came across a copy of Wilson's book, The Occult, and it just knocked me out. It was just so well written, and it's about all these occult and mystical and paranormal ideas, but in the context of a philosophy of consciousness that he had been working on like a decade prior to that. And I didn't know those works until later on, but it just grabbed me because he was talking about it in context of literature and philosophy and history, and also these strange powers that we possess but we don't know we possess, but if we study and try, we can actualize them. And I said, yeah, I'm all for that. So that's what that's what I've been trying to do for this. How many years is it now? 45, something like that. So I don't know how much, I don't know how far I've got with it, but at least it's been a very interesting journey.
Yeah, for sure. It very much feels as though you're one of the torchbearers for Colin Wilson and his approach, particularly obviously with Beyond the Robot, but in general, in your approach, I see in your work is to bring together a lot of different threads of mysticism, religion, phenomenology, existentialism, literature, art, and culture, and all the rest of it, in find these sort of points of commonality between them, which I think is fascinating. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to write the kinds of books that I liked reading, and the sort that Wilson wrote, where he was enormously well read. He knew everything, and he was able to make these connections between things. So you say he makes connections between phenomenology, which is it's difficult to say in the first place, and then it's it's a very demanding, disciplined philosophical methodology. And he's connecting that up with mystical experience and poetry and these occult. And he also writes these wonderful, very lively, warts and all kind of biographies and biographical sketches of a lot of these characters. So I was introduced to a lot of people that I've subsequently written about by, from reading the occult, people like Crowley and Gurdjieff and Blavatsky and Uspensky and Yeats and all that. And it's sort of, as you said, he has a very objective view, but I don't mean any kind of cold, dry way. But it's very balanced, and I guess I've come you don't set out trying to do something. You discover that you are doing it, down the line. And after writing a few books, I realized, oh, this is what, I'm kind of doing, is, bringing things together, trying to make a coherent narrative of a lot of, you know, crazy stuff, especially nowadays when we do seem to be living in a time, at least in the West, when things are fragmenting, and breaking up, at, an alarming rate, which, in many different ways, in social ways and political ways and ecological ways,
Yeah.
and even in our own identities and things like that. I mean, I just was thinking today, and I heard on the news that, okay, it's official, it's law, you have to wear the face mask when you're on public transport. Do you think there's going to be films in the future where, when you're out, the scenes when they're out and about, everyone's going to be wearing the mask? Just as like that's what they do. Just like everyone in films now has their phone out all the time and it's also on the phone. And if you look at films back, a few decades, people are smoking a lot. So it's like not here is a film about people wearing masks. Just like, well, people wear masks, so they're in the films now. It's just a strange, kind of thing to think. Oh, are we going to be seeing things like that?
Yeah.
And, in any case, so I hope not for long. I hope, I guess we all hope that, a cure or whatever you want to call it is found to, if not bring things back to normal, at least make, life healthier.
Yeah, especially in tandem with the kind of sort of the breakdown of social reality, but also just breakdown of just, as you say, just kind of reality in general.
This is, well, I mean, this is what hit me. Just like, it's a couple ways. There's all different avenues, from postmodernism, from reality TV, from kind of new thought, mental science, from occultism in general. There's the whole idea that reality is malleable. It's not this fixed R, reality with a capital R, that whatever materialistic science says it is, or whatever logic says it is, something like that. And we people who are interested in the occult and the paranormal and all that say, yeah, right on, we don't want it to be like that. But now that it isn't like that, it's like, ooh, it's not quite exactly the way we wanted it to be. And we find out that other people had that same idea, and they've all come together at the same time. So I call it trickle down metaphysics, because the notion of reality being, malleable, or not being all it's supposed to be, kind of, let's say it starts with Nietzsche in the 1880s. Nihilism is on its way and all this, and I speak not for today nor for tomorrow, but for the day after tomorrow, and nobody's listening to him. And then, in the 1920s, Heidegger starts taking it seriously. We made a wrong turn at Plato. We have to go back before Plato, go back to the pre-Socratics. We have to deconstruct Western metaphysics, because it's taken us away from being, the capital B, and we're living these inauthentic lives because we're not in touch with true being. And but well, he's a Nazi, so we have to pay attention to him. And then that gets into the universities, and then by the 60s and 70s, it's all the deconstructionists have been taught this, and they're mixing it up with kind of neo-Marxism and stuff like that. And by the time, I guess, I mean, I went back to university in the sort of early 80s, after being out for some time during my career in music. And it was mother's milk. The whole idea that there's no stable reality, there's no truth with capital T, everything is relative, and it's all driven by power. It's all different power groups that are battling each other, Foucault and all this kind of thing. And sort of like, wow, this is really scary 100 years ago. Now, you're writing your 49 thesis about it, and it's all, it's like, it's just saturated to the whole culture. And then the next step was to go, it seeped out past the academies into the everyday world, into reality television. And my joke about Trump is that, he was a reality TV star for a long time, and that primed him for, where he is today. He was The Apprentice, and he, hired and fired and all that. And then, but also, we've put so much reality into the television. Reality TV is the most popular thing. We have a reality TV show about people who watch people watching reality TV, and then talk about that. There's no more room in there. something had to pop out. We were shoving too much stuff into the simulation. So what popped out was Trump. Because he popped out of being this reality TV star, and he said, "Well, okay, you know." And then on top of that, he popped out at a time when everyone was saying, "Oh, there's no truth, or you can make your own reality." Sounds good to me. And that's what he was sort of taught to do for a long time, because he was a follower of Norman Vincent Peale and power of positive thinking, and facts don't matter. It's the attitude that matters, and you know, and just focus on your goals and all that. And I mean, that's in the other book, but it's sort of like, yeah, we live in a time where suddenly that's why I say he's the singularity. You know, everything's different after the singularity. Well, everything is different now. And that's why I say, you know, he's the bearer of chaos. Well, what's happening there now? So I'm not, you know, claiming this, but it's just sort of like, it sort of saw it coming, you know, it was on its way. And I hope, you know, what do you hope? I hope we can, well, I don't know. Who knows how long this is going to last? You know, how do you get reality back? That's a good question.
Yeah, yeah, and especially in the time when you've got this things like sort of subcultures developing primarily online, I believe, like tulpamancy. I don't know if you've come across. There's a sort of a new subculture of people who call themselves tulpamancers, and they're creating. They claim to be creating.
Oh, tulpa. Oh, say okay, right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, creating tulpas. And then,
probably got it for me, because I said Trump was a tulpa. So
well, there you go. I mean, it's
I started the trend.
yeah, Trump is the ultimate tulpa. You know, he's the tulpa of the sort of the collective psyche of the American nation, by extension, the world. And then you've even got people.
And the problem with tulpas is they you know, you lose control of them.
They lose control.
They run out on their own, you know.
Exactly. And what these tulpamancers are talking about is, you know, oh, I've lost control of my tulpa, now he's creating another one. And they're also talking about bringing in passports, quite seriously suggesting that, you know, I have several different identities, and therefore, you know, I should have a passport for each one of them. This is like no joke. This is actually on the table of like, okay.
All things are possible. Everything is possible. You know, nothing is true. Everything is permitted. And yeah, it's I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm considering myself somebody from the old days where, oh, you're one of those people from back then when, you know, there was something called reality, and and I'm someone who was wanting to widen the doors of perception and all that. But even I am concerned about the way everything's just kind of exploded. I mean, that's the point I make in at the end of Dark Store, but also in the book before then, Lost Knowledge, Imagination, where I mean, what do you say? The alternative to a too reductive, you know, narrow, materialistic, dogmatic kind of vision of the world is not necessarily just turn on the taps and let it rip, because that has its own. Initially, that's liberating. That feels fantastic, but then after a while, you start to, there's no boundaries here. There's nothing to press up against, and everything is drifting and shifting and changing constantly, and all that. And you run out of that leads to a different kind of negative state, rather than this kind of oppressive state where you feel hemmed in. This is where you just feel dissipated completely, and you lose all sense of value. There's no hierarchy. There's no way to, there's no criteria by which to judge any reality better than another, and all that, except practical, utilitarian. What's useful, anything like that. So, and in that book, I do say, well, I recount what Henri Corbin, who's the great French phenomenologist and scholar of Persian mysticism, said that what's needed is this kind of a tradition of sort of a disciplined imagination. A kind of his imagination for him is a precision instrument. It isn't just kind of letting fantasy rip or daydreams or something like that. It's a tool. It's a cognitive tool. That you have to learn how to use, and there's ways you can gauge when your imagination is somehow leading you to some cognitive reality, or when it's taking you towards some fantasy and all that. And I mean, that's the difficult question, but there are practices to do that. But he does talk about a tradition. So there's a place for a tradition, but maybe not necessarily in the way that the traditionalists talk about. And we know what that tradition is. There's a whole, there's one in the East that's people have known about, for a long time. But the West has its own tradition as well. The whole Hermetic, esoteric, school, variety of different schools of different meditative practices and practices of kind of creative visualization and things of that sort. So it doesn't, I talk about some of them in the Russia, in the book on Russia and in other places as well. So they do exist, but it's finding that kind of balance between, if you're repressed for too long, then the last thing you want to do is discipline yourself. You want to let it rip and have fun and go wild and all that. And if that goes on for too long, then you do want some kind of order, but it usually is something a bit harder than you really need and want, So it's what I call the Goldilocks kind of effect, when it's just right. It's not too hot, not too cold, it's just right. And it's not easy to achieve. It can be. I mean, well, at least historically it seems to have been. At least the people I've read said it is possible.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things about the Russia book, as I say, what these people were talking about in the Silver Age, this need to develop a kind of cosmology and ecology and economy, a social and political sense that takes in this spiritual world of values and meaning and purpose and all that, and doesn't try to reduce them to purely material kind of causes. Takes them very seriously. Takes the soul seriously. This could this would be a way of perhaps we can. I'm not saying it's going to have all the answers, but it can provide something that we could use today. To try and get over this time that we're in now. That this could be a way to reach that kind of Goldilocks effect in the world now, because we do need this kind of, more than ever, we need this kind of union of these opposites. Although it's not, as you said, it's no longer just two opposites. It's no longer just two polarities. It's a lot of different things, fragmenting in often different ways. So maybe the whole game has changed. So I don't know.
Yeah, and something. I'm glad you mentioned Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, because that's a book that really has been quite important for me in terms of pointing out, highlighting at least the potential for some sort of mapping of this experiential territory of the imaginal realms, as Corbyn calls them, and my own kind of trajectory has taken me from my own sort of early 20s and such like, of just fairly reckless experimentation with drugs and kind of little bit of dabbling in kind of chaos magic, and obviously reading a bit of Crowley. I never really got into the practical side of Crowley, and kind of think it might have been not so good for me if I did. I think my consciousness wouldn't really be that well suited to it. But and then coming back and sort of then in my mid-20s searching for some sort of order, and then lurching too far in the opposite direction, ending up basically in a cult of a chap called Muji. If you've come across this.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, he's like the kind of, he's a modern version of Osho, essentially.
Okay, all right.
Very charismatic Jamaican dude who talks about sort of this kind of very neat, fluffy kind of neo-Advaita, but very, very eloquent and very sort of persuasive and hypnotic to listen to. And then, lurching out of that, and then sort of, getting back into sort of going crazy and partying and blah, whatever. And then trying to find this sort of, right, let's just try and steer a middle way here, and the people and the ideas you talk about in that book, Lost Knowledge of the Imagination, I think are really important in guiding, in at least offering the potential for a guide. People like Kathleen Rain, Goethe, and Rudolf Steiner as well.
Yeah. I mean, Kathleen Rain's really important. She's one of my heroes, I would say. And people don't know, she was a poet, an essayist, and a Blake scholar. She's probably best known for being a Blake scholar. And for many years, she ran the Temenos Academy, which is still going. And it's a sort of alternative, I don't know if it's accredited or not, but it's a kind of alternative educational, adult educational kind of organization where they have different lectures about different versions of the perennial philosophy. So you have Eastern, but also, you know, Western, Meister Eckhart and Dante and things of that sort, of Plato, and you know, but you know, you would have the Upanishads and you know, the Buddha and things of that sort as well. Yeah, she had this phrase called the lost knowledge imagination, or the rejected knowledge of the imagination, or the teaching of the imagination. And it's this is her traditionalism, but what she means by that is this kind of tradition of the imagination, not a tradition of like, here is the law, here is the, you know, here's the right way, and if you fall from this, you know, you are doomed. It's no, it was, but it was a whole tradition that took the imagination seriously. I mean, you know, for us, if you look up most definitions, imagination will say it has something to do with things that aren't real, the unreal. That's just your imagination. Or it's cutting edge. You know, you're innovative and you're ahead of your competitors. You know, if you use your imagination and of course, it also has, you know, we give it a place in the arts and all that. You know, although it seems to be in less evidence these days, as far as I'm concerned. But what she believed about this tradition of the imagination was all the metaphors and images and similes and symbols that she found in the poetry of the great poets, or the great romantic poets for her, people like Blake and Shelley and Coleridge and Keats, and in religious writing. She said these actually were symbols of the actual soul. I mean, imagination for her was a soul. It's a real soul. It's not just a word we have that we use, but it's an actual reality that the ancients knew of. You know, Plato knows of it, and the Neoplatonists know of it. And it went out of fashion. But at different times, it's like this underground kind of river that at different times it emerges back out into you know, above ground, and it informed the great poets, or later on it informed people like Yeats and others and all that. And but she said it's not just letting the imagination go and letting rip. There's well, she makes the distinction that Coleridge makes in his Biographia Literaria, where he says basically the distinction between imagination and fancy, or fantasy, where sort of fancy or fantasy takes things that are already created and puts them together in strange kind of ways. So we talked about, you know, Velcroing things together. And postmodernism does that all the time. Take a bit of this, take a bit of that, whack it together, and here it's something new. And you know, surrealism used to do that, but I think with a bit more pizzazz and a bit more interest. You know, you have the unlikely occurrence of an umbrella on an operating table. It's like one of the early kind of, you know, definitions or examples of it. So yeah, you take things that are in their own context are perfectly ordinary, but you put them in strange contexts, and they evoke strange kind of thing. And yes, it has a certain charm and a certain, you know, kind of charge to it, but it's not true imagination in the sense that Coleridge means, because it doesn't it makes things that are new, but not in a new novel. They're original in the sense that they reach down into the origins of things, into the archetypes for Jung, or the Platonic ideals if you're Platonist, or into the spiritual world or something like that. And so there's a distinction there, and this true imagination has a real power. You know, and Coleridge says that it's the same power with which, you know, God or the divine creates the world. You know, that our perception of the world is part of this primary imagination through which and by which the world is created. So our perception of the world is a creative act. This Husserl picks up on this later on. He says perception is intentional. You know, the Western idea is perception is just it's passive. You know, we're mirrors reflecting what's outside, and we say no. We're actually giving shape and form to what would be formless and chaos on its own. You know, or the ensemplastic power, which is precisely what you were saying before, taking things and putting them together. And so this is something we do already, just perceiving things, and then the artist takes it, you know, a step further. And there's ways, you know, there's a whole tradition of that. And this is the great tradition of classical, beautiful art. And she has this wonderful essay she wrote in the 60s called The Use of the Beautiful. And you can say this is kind of the beginning of postmodernism, or, you know, going back to conceptual art and all that. You say, like, yes, art's interesting, it's striking, it's shocking, it's controversial, but is any of it beautiful anymore. There doesn't seem to be anything that's beautiful in the classical sense of beauty. You know, the great Greek sculptures and the grand masters of painting and all that. And there doesn't seem to be a place for it. And it even seems to be a kind of anti-beauty, a whole kind of attack on it in some ways. And she says that, you know, what she feels is behind that is that the beauty sets too high an example. And we feel we're never going to meet that example, and we feel resentful at it, because, you know, it highlights our, her flaws. And so rather than try to meet this example, we tear it down. And I think that says a lot about a great deal of our culture for the last 50 years or so, or something like that. So, you know, she's I've been reading her for a very long time, and I was very glad I had an opportunity to write this book. And, you know, it was a chapter about her, but I take this theme of the knowledge of the imagination and I bring other people together at the same time, because in different ways, well, it's, say, there's knowledge that the imagination itself provides us, and then there's knowledge about the imagination. You know, so, you know, we know things through the imagination, and then there are things about the imagination that we need to know. And Goethe, someone, you know, in the chapter on him, I show how he actually learned things about the natural world through the use of imagination, his pursuit of the Urpflanze, the primal plant. You know, and he was able to sort of visualize this kind of archetypal plant from which all of the plants came. And Corbin is another one. So there's other examples in the book of how, in different ways, imagination isn't about make-believe, it's about make-real. And just this language helps us there. I realize something. What does it mean if you realize something? It means, oh, you know, you knew it, then you really know it. You know, oh, you know, I realized that was true. You have made it real. I mean, that may sound like a lame way of saying it, but actually, you know, we're aware of this stuff already in many ways, and it's many ways in part of the way we live in practice and act in the world, but we don't know that's what we're doing. And in some ways, I think at this point, there's lots of practices. There's tons of different practices you can take, tons of different spiritual traditions you can follow. Any of them will help you. Any road will take you somewhere. You know, but I think we need to have a body of ideas behind these things now. So I don't mean just theory, but, you know, so much has been written over the last century about this kind of stuff that we can sift through it and find some things where there's a kind of common working hypothesis that applies to, you know, all of them in different ways. And in a way, a kind of new perennial philosophy in some ways, you might want to say, where, because I think if you don't have a body of ideas behind or something, then you'll miss out on something. And if you kind of are aware of something and then you notice something you're experiencing, you say, oh yes, that's an example of that. What I was reading about, that's an example of that. You know, I haven't gone out of my way to try and make that happen, but I've noticed that it has happened. And so I think with that kind of grounding, you can give yourself something concrete in your own experience to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. It ties in with a lot of ideas that I was speaking about last night. I was on a podcast with Jason Horsley, who's a writer and blogger you may have come across. But we're talking about many related things to do with sort of the creative process, allowing you to sort of step into the role of the observing principle. If you write a piece of fiction using autobiographical material, then, or even if you write an autobiography or a book that has some reference to your own experience, you're sort of taking your life material and then going, okay, now I'm sort of creating something objective now and observing it. So you're stepping back into that sort of prior role. And another thing we were talking about quite extensively was the role of drugs and psychedelics in that. I was wondering what your view of the role of these things is. Obviously they're exploding now in the
well, I mean, I don't write a great deal about psychedelics, and my own experience of them is I don't know, I guess by today's standard is fairly limited. So I've tried them in the past. I enjoyed mushrooms much more than I enjoyed LSD. I didn't particularly care for LSD. Everything seemed to be sweating and made of tinsel for a very long time. So I don't know. Maybe it wasn't good stuff. But I mean, I think, you know, and yes, you're right. It's such an enormous kind of industry. And this is something I noticed. Somebody in some tweet or something said the psychedelic industry, and that sounded, was that a name of a band, or is that this new world that we're in now? And I mentioned earlier that I went to the Breaking Convention a few years ago,
Mm.
and you had the people that wanted to keep it sacred. This the entheogen people, and you have to take these drugs, and you have to, there's sacred intent, a spiritual intent, and you have to do it in this context, and with the indigenous people and all that. And then you had the MAPS people who were using it for therapeutic purposes, and yes, we need it, but we need to use it within this kind of therapeutic environment, and it's all for working out your neuroses and whatever it is and all that. And then you had the smaller contingent, just, hey, let's just take the stuff and see what happens.
Yeah.
The weird, my friend Eric Davis, he was
Yeah.
one who did talk about keep it weird. And I mean, I can understand that, because that's sort of, how should we say it, well, I don't want to alienate people, but I mean, if something enormous was going to happen with this stuff, and people have been expecting it for, I don't know, how 50, 60 years now, it doesn't seem to have happened, the big thing that was supposed to happen.
Yeah.
That doesn't take away from the value that they can have. And if you have had, mystical or, life transforming experiences on them, then of course, the more power to you. But, they're not, it's not a panacea. They don't work in the same way all the time. And Coleridge, this is going back a couple centuries, but I'm not Coleridge, De Quincey, when he was sort of asked about, oh, the opium, does it make you write your poetry? There was this whole romantic idea, if you took drugs, you could write fantastic music and poetry and all that. And he said, like, well, it only releases what you have already. So if a man who is among oxen all day long takes the opium, he's going to dream about oxen. Whereas, someone who's, reads and is cultured and has an awareness of history and all that something, his dreams will be so much more, enlarged and all that kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, they can be used for good purposes. It's not, I mean, I have my own, inebriants, whatever I, use for personal reasons, but I'm more interested in everyday consciousness than in altering it in that way, because I guess I follow Colin Wilson's idea that everyday consciousness is actually subnormal. It's not, and those moments, peak experiences, or these moments of kind of, imagination moments, or participatory moments, or the imaginal, or satoris, or whatever you want to call them, they're moments when actually consciousness is working the way it should work normally. We're working under a cloud. We're subject to what Wilson calls the robot, or Gershow says we're mechanical, or we're not awake, or whatever metaphor you want to use. But there seems to be, we've come to accept a kind of low level of consciousness, a low intensity level of consciousness as the norm, when it's actually subnormal. So I'm more interested in, okay, well, what's keeping it subnormal? What are the things that are keeping it kind of subnormal? I mean, I mentioned this the other day at an interview. I mean, a few weeks ago, when it was one of the very, very sunny days we had, and I've been, sticking with the lockdown, kind of regimen, but I'm very lucky. I have a little garden here, and I remember just stepping outside, after working, and looking up at the sun, and I was surprised by the sun. And by me saying that, I don't mean it was hiding behind a cloud and said, peekaboo, it was like I looked up and said, well, what is that? And it was like, not as if I haven't seen the sun for the last 60 something years, but it just momentarily, very, very briefly, it was like, that is real. It's like, it's just, all the things that went through your head in 2 seconds about, it's 93 million miles away, it's gigantic, and blah, blah, blah. We're part of this vast expanse where we don't know anything's going on. And it was just sort of like, yeah, that's kind of real consciousness. I mean, I didn't take any drug or anything. I just popped out the door, looked over my shoulder, and was surprised by something that I see every day. And this is the cliche about seeing a leaf for the first time, but I think that's true. And I know people take such substances, and they have those kind of experiences too. So I'm not saying you can't have those with that. But there just seemed to be something about, well, if I take, well, it says to me, I take most of my experience for granted all the time. I'm inured to it. I'm used to it all the time. And the slight, I mean, I'm lucky, the lockdown hasn't been much of a misery for me, but the slight kind of constraint of basically having to stay in, it did create a kind of, crisis mode, sub-crisis mode. So in some way, I involuntarily did something inside me that allowed me, when I popped out the door, to have that kind of moment for, a brief moment. And I've experienced different things like that at, different times, not gigantic, big samadhi, cosmic consciousness moments, but these kind of, I guess they fall into the more satori kind of line, or the isness. You sort of suddenly, oh, that's real. That gnarly root coming out of the ground there. That's very real. It's actually quite fascinating.
Mm.
and if so it's something along those kinds of lines. So
yeah, I very much relate to that. Something we were talking about in the interview last night was this search for I think sometimes in the psychedelics community you get this kind of obsessive search for the next sort of hit. It's really gonna blow everything away, and you get people going all over the world and going on ayahuasca retreat after ayahuasca, peyote and 5-MeO DMT or whatever it is, and that's part of people's path. That's part of your experimentation. That's cool. But for myself, in the past couple of years, I've become more interested in the everyday. It's like, well, great. There's these mushrooms that you can take now and then. They give you an interesting effect on your consciousness, but what about all the other mushrooms that are in the woods? What are they? What do they do? There's some that are poisonous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't try all of them.
We must have figured that out at some point of just trying them. Hang on, that one makes me feel a bit weird, and the sort of the plants and the different types of trees that are around me of wild flowers. And one of the nice things about being locked down here with my family is that I've been sort of go for a walk with my mum now and then. So I haven't done that for years really, but she's got this vast repository of plant knowledge. And I go,
wow.
hey, what's that flower? And she go, oh, that's a borage or whatever it is. And I go, oh, right, didn't even know that was a specific type of flower. I assumed it was a forget-me-not or something. Finding that fascination in the everyday world, I think, is a really important thing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Kathleen Rain, she said the imagination doesn't see different things; it sees things differently. So, and I would say that the content of mystical experience is pretty much the content of everyday experience, but you're seeing it in a different way. And I'm not negating sort of visionary experiences where it's not the everyday. You're on some strange kind of journey and trip, and the sorts of things that say Jung experienced when he went his descent into the unconscious and through active imagination, or Corbin writes about with Suwarwadi taking these inner journeys and all that. So I mean, we can start to fine tune, is that mystical, or it's visionary, but the particular kind of thing that I'm talking about, I guess this kind of isness experience it's everyday sorts of things. And again, I'm not trying to go out of my way to be every day. I am every day. I don't have to do anything to be every day. But it's recognizing that it's whatever change you have to make, it has to be something that's taking place inside you, inside your consciousness in some way. And these little moments when you see very familiar objects and they strike you as new and fresh, and I haven't seen that before, then somehow you've slipped out of that harness of the kind of, what do you want to call it, ordinary, what we take to be ordinary, usual consciousness, which it edits out. I mean, one of the people I always refer to is the philosopher Henri Bergson, and I get this from Huxley, because Huxley in Doors of Perception He's taken the mescaline and he's trying to account for himself, what the mescaline's actually doing. Why is it having these effects? Because he's seeing the world as the first day of creation. He says, I'm seeing the world as Adam saw it, and he's transfixed by the folds in the curtain, and the bindings on his books are jeweled, and they're just radiating being. They're just it's just shouting at him, being and all that. And Bergson had this idea that the brain served an eliminative function. The brain was an organ designed to cut out reality and only allow a very small amount of it to reach consciousness. Otherwise, we would be completely swamped by everything around us. James talked about the blooming, buzzing confusion. Of it was all whatever, how many units of sense data around us all the time. With temperature, sound, sight, pressure. So many different things around us, which we somehow organize into what we call the world, and we're doing it involuntarily. We're doing it on some subconscious level. We don't know we're doing it, and we present this world to ourselves, and we kind of take it for granted that it's just, that's how the world is. But we've gone through this whole editing process to be able to hand ourselves this kind of formed picture of the world. And what Huxley thought was that, what the mescaline did was it, different metaphors, it sort of lifted the filter, or it turned on the taps, and you're getting a lot more reality than you usually get. So, he's transfixed by looking at the folds in the curtain, and so on. And yes, everything is just radiating this deep, deep meaning. It's not a logical meaning. It's not a meaning he can, point his figure to. It's this implicit sort of felt, visceral sort of meaning. But there's a downside to that, is that he talks about looking over at the dishes in his sink, and they were too beautiful to wash. And Huxley was a very sober psychonaut. He was a very sober experimenter with these things. I'm sure we can think of many examples where there are less sober characters, where there are a lot more beautiful dishes in the sink and didn't get washed. So he said, yes, the mescaline turns off this, again, different metaphor. It raises the filter, or turns off this incessant kind of editor in our consciousness. And allows all this other meaning to come through, and it's wonderful and all that, but it inhibits the will. We don't see any reason to do anything. There's no reason to get up and wash the dishes because they're too beautiful. And he says, if everyone took mescaline, there'd be no war, but there'd also be no civilization. And I'm sure many people can say, well, that's a good idea, but I think that sounds good, but in the long run, it doesn't really work out. The reason there wouldn't be any civilization, because no one would want to bother to do anything as dull as that. And so there's a certain sense where we need the editor. And an example I give is, when you're crossing the street and you look and you suddenly see a car hurtling at you. You don't need to know the make and model of the car. You just need to know that it's huge body coming at you, and you have to get out of the way. Later on, you're walking back home and you see the car parked. You can look, that's a 1966 Jaguar, and whatever. You can, at your leisure, take in all the other information. But when it's threatening you, you just need to edit it down to the bare minimum, sort of thing. And we need to do that. It's a survival. It's our limited left brain, narrow consciousness is something we developed evolutionarily because we needed it. But what's happened is that it works too well. It cuts out too much. And so we're very practical. We've conquered the world. We're able to deal with the world. We're going out and, going to conquer Mars next. We're able to deal with all the practical, utilitarian, pragmatic, functional sorts of things, but we've lost touch with any kind of sense of meaning, which you can't get that way. You can't. There's a wonderful, wonderful quote from J.B. Priestley. He said, "We gain wisdom at the price of precision." Gain wisdom at the price of precision. No such thing as precise wisdom. It's precision is this pinpoint accuracy about something, but it's disconnected from the whole. And wisdom is a broader, general, kind of thing where if you try to fine tune it too much, it just, it loses any of its power. So it's a trade-off. We need both of them, but this editing faculty, which enables us to edit out 99% of reality and enables us to focus our energies on separate things, and has enabled us to, you and I live lives of ease and have that easy grasp technology that kings of old couldn't even have dreamed of. This is all because of this very narrow, boring kind of left brain consciousness. But it does its job too well, that it edits out too much. And then we're left with this hunger for something else. We don't know quite what it is. There's something's missing. We can't quite put a finger on it. And every now and then we have moments of, and whatever it is, we suddenly feel relaxed, and this kind of meaning is coming to us, and we go out of our way to take toxins in order to induce that. Alcohol. When alcohol was discovered, that's how the gods, we get in touch with the gods. First eating the first fermenting plant, suddenly, for some reason, alcohol has this effect of relaxing this editor, in our heads. And that's why wine and poetry go together. Suddenly you're looking at something after a glass of wine, and it's much more interesting than it was before that glass of wine. And it's not that it's false. It's the wine has relaxed this incessant, overworking, overzealous sub-editor who's like, cutting out all the unnecessary words all the time. Maybe you kind of go from, I don't know, Hemingway to Proust, moving into literary kind of metaphors, but you go from like, just the facts, ma'am, to suddenly it's the longest sentence in the world, and you're lingering over each word, and you can just taste them going through your mouth and all that, and it's a completely different kind of experience. But the problem is that that's not practical. When Wordsworth saw the tree in the middle of the field, the other farmers were saying, what's with Billy? Like, he's looking at the tree. It's beautiful to him, but they just want to get it out of the way because they need to plow. So it's a very, both of these things are necessary. And this is, the essence of Ian McGilchrist's book, Master and Emissary, the two sides of the brain, or these two modes of consciousness, fight each other. And over time, the left, or that narrow focusing, editing process has taken precedent, and it's marginalized the other. But that's where we get all the sense of meaning and everything. Sense of meaning and purpose. We live in a culture where the kind of fundamental assumption is that life is meaningless, the universe is meaningless, there's no purpose to it, it's not going anywhere. And again, getting back to my book, that's what these Russian thinkers are arguing against. They're saying, no, it's there. You've just narrowed. You narrowed the criteria for truth. You've narrowed the criteria for knowledge. You've narrowed the criteria for accepting anything. And what you've made as the fundamental, criteria for what's true is if it works, if it's practical, if it's utilitarian. And, Auden says poetry doesn't do anything. It's not supposed to do anything. It's supposed to be. It's supposed to change you. It's not supposed to change the world. It's not supposed to go have some effect on the outer world. It has an effect on you. And it transforms how you see the world. And but that's the millennium, when we finally come around to realizing that all that kind of stuff, that the hard nose, strictly rigorous, we're sorry it's like this, but we have to face facts, all that kind of sensibility finally realizes that, well, actually all this stuff that we've been jettisoning, thinking was superstition and illusory, is actually a completely other way of understanding and being in the world, which we absolutely need. Then that will happen. So I hope it's next week, but I'm not holding my breath. But
it certainly seems like the hunger for that seems to be growing continuously, and just in general, there's a sort of growing. To call it an industry maybe is a little reductive, but to some extent there is an industry of psychological, philosophical, mystical explorations. Now they're all kind of online forums, but previously it was kind of various different lecture circuits and things like that. I thought you made a really interesting point earlier about how when you went out into the sun and you felt like it surprised you. It's like seeing it for the first time. It was something fresh about the experience. That's, as you say, and this is echoed by people like Colin Wilson as well. That should be normal. That's just natural. And it reminded me of one of the more interesting things I remember hearing at Breaking Convention was Bruce Parry talking about his experience of living with various different tribes and how the most powerful experiences he had were actually not with the plant medicines, but just with the foragers who were in this open state of consciousness all the time, out of pure necessity, just because, you know, if you want to shoot a blow dart at a monkey in a tree that's, you know, 50 meters away, you have to be pretty focused. You have to be pretty open to what's going on. But this felt like, you know, it's almost like we in our civilized world, and this includes all of the tribes, all of the other tribes he was living with, because they're all you know, agriculturalists or pastoralists to some extent. So they're all kind of in our category. We're all just like people who have to plant things and grow them and raise animals and to stay alive, basically. And we're all in this state where, you know, okay, we have to imbibe the medicine now to kind of achieve it. I don't know if it's quite as clear cut. Maybe there's I'm sure there's forager tribes who also experiment with.
Yeah, sure.
But it was just an interesting little kind of take on that, you know.
No, I mean, it's true. I mean, there's ways of life where you're. I mean, we are the way we are because the world, you know, we created, sort of necessitated it. I mean, we moved to cities, and this is one thing Colin Wilson says. You know, we probably at a much earlier time in human history, the kinds of some of the sort of paranormal phenomena or powers that, you know, we find in some people today were probably shared, you know, by everyone. And animals probably have them in some kind of way. And so an intuitive sort of connection to the earth, to the ground. And so like dowsing, people who douse today, there probably was something, you know, back then, because we needed to be able to find the water. But, you know, for some reason, something happened. We started making cities, we started coming together and other things, and we found other ways to protect ourselves, other ways to, you know, provide and survive. And these created conditions where these earlier powers would have gotten in the way in a certain, you know, they wouldn't quite, they would make life more difficult for you. And I mean, he doesn't give an example from that time, but he gives an example in contemporary time where he talks about there's a Dutch psychic, Peter Herkos. And he starts out, he's a painter or something like that, just, you know, regular job, and then he falls as an accident, and when he's in the hospital, he can kind of read people's minds, and he's sort of precognitive, and all this information's coming to him, but he doesn't have any control over it, and he can't go back to his normal job, and he can't get any other job, and it was only when he figured out that, oh, I can become a stage magician or something like that he was able to sort of, you know, support himself. So in the world we're in, the conditions here aren't really suited for these kind of earlier powers. So for better or worse, we made cities. Obviously, you know, there's a lot wrong with them these days, and, you know, but again, this is a work in progress, sadly, or, you know, regress, whatever, work in regress, whatever you call it. But, you know, it's not all fixed out already. You know, it wasn't somebody decided, okay, now we will build cities. It seems like a good idea back then at the time for reasons that were probably very good. And then, you know, things happen, you make something that creates another problem, and you go on and you go on. And, you know, we're facing something like that today. But I would think, you know, we do have, you know, there's so many examples. Everyone has an example of some telepathic experience, or everyone has an example of a dream that, you know, oh, you know, you dreamed about somebody and then you found out they were in the hospital, whatever it is. Everyone has these kinds of things. And I think you're right. I think there's more and more a sense of, there has been, certainly since the 60s, I would say, you know, growing this kind of sense of a kind of spiritual hunger. It emerges in all different ways. It emerges in retrograde ways. People take advantage of it. You know, gurus take advantage of it. People make money from it and all that. And that's unavoidable because everything's taken advantage of, you know, in this world. There's nothing that remains pure and all that. But I would think even in the midst of all that, there's still a real hunger. All that industry wouldn't exist if there wasn't that kind of hunger. And that hunger isn't necessarily always satisfied with something, you know, from the spiritual way. It can be satisfied in a political way. It can be satisfied in a social way. It's fundamentally a hunger for meaning and belonging to something. And, you know, you can belong to a cult, and the guru gives you this kind of sense of belonging, and he gives you a sense of meaning and purpose, and you take what he says as the truth and all that, and suddenly you've got the world is, you know, lined up for you. Or it could be a demagogue, a political leader. who does the same thing as a guru, but in a much bigger crowd, and has a much larger effect on the world around him. And the tough job is when you try to find that kind of sense of meaning through your own efforts, and not have it given to you from, you know, the guru or the demagogue, or, you know, or some other relationship or something like that. But it is a sense of, you know, needing to feel you belong to something larger than just your independent ego. And again, that's a legitimate hunger and desire, but it can be abused, and it can be taken advantage of. And that's one of the dangers too that we're seeing these days, because we don't have the narratives anymore we used to have, whether it was religion or some political narrative or this notion of progress. All of those things seem to have, you know, hit a wall, and they don't seem to be doing it anymore. So all the grand narratives are broken down, and reality is broken down, but that hunger is still there. And you know, you have the kind of, you know, grassroots variety of different ways people, you know, trying to satisfy them through a variety of different spiritual practices or psychotherapeutic practices or whatever, or, you know, political ones. You know, you join political party, or, you know, just it might even be that you join some protest group or something. You might not, I'm not saying this is the case for all protest, but you could be, it's not the particular cause that's attractive to you. It's the fact that you can put yourself in it, and you're part of this cause. You're part of this larger kind of thing.
Mm. Yeah, or even in a, you know, in pre-lockdown days, you might go to a sports event and chant
Exactly.
and cheer with a bunch of people. It's one of the few situations in the modern world where you can gather in a public space with a large number of people and kind of sing the same thing with them, and that's just a very powerful thing to do. You know?
It's numinous. I can't imagine it wouldn't be a numinous experience. You
Yeah.
know, you're briefly, you know, you're part of some larger kind of body. And I long time ago, when there was what was it, 2003, when there was the march to, you know, not start the war.
That's right.
You know, the Iraq kind of thing. And I remember I was on it, and I was like Leicester Square or somewhere like that. And I remember looking behind me, and I saw people were doing the wave, you know, they were doing this. And so lots of people doing that. And I said, okay, when it comes to me, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to maintain, you know, my individual self and all that kind of blah, blah kind of thing. And then as it got closer, I felt my body just reacting to it. And I had to consciously stop myself from doing it. And it was something that didn't have anything to do with my conscious mind. It wasn't my rational ego. It was something, I don't know. I wasn't holding hands with anybody. It just came through. So some kind of, what do you want to call it? Non-physical force, some animal magnetism or whatever, seemed to run through the crowd. And so, you know, that reminded me that we live on different levels. We have different levels. You know, we're used to me talking, you know, what I think and all that, and we're not. You know, we forget that there's other levels, structures of consciousness, whatever you want to call them, that have a life of their own in many ways. You know, we all kind of work together, but they still have a kind of life of their own. You know, and my body was physically reacting to this energy that was coming through the crowd, and it wanted to be one with everyone else. And so, you know. So yeah, I mean, and you can get excited that, you know, I'm not a sports fan, but when my sons would be here and watch a game, I would get excited with them.
So before we go, do you want to sort of say a little bit about where maybe any viewers can find your work online?
Well, I have a blog. It's just my name, lowercase, GaryLachman.co.uk. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. Books, you know, I'm on Amazon, and, you know, it's, you know, all the usual outlets. So yeah, and thank you for having me on the show. I enjoyed it very much.